When people think about medieval knightly orders, they usually picture armor, crusades, and famous battles. But the men who led these orders did not all meet the same end. Some died in war, some were brought down by politics, and some passed away far from the battlefield after long years of command. In this video, we are looking at how the leaders of the major medieval knightly orders actually died, and what their final days reveal about the real world of medieval warfare, power, and survival. Number 1. Jacques de Molay. Jacques de Molay, the last Grand Master of the Knights Templar, did not die the way most people picture a medieval order leader. By the time he reached the top, the Templars were already one of the richest and most famous military orders in Europe and the crusader world, but their power no longer guaranteed military success. The loss of the crusader mainland had pushed the order back to Cyprus, and Molay was spending more time dealing with plans, negotiations, and pressure from rulers than riding at the head of a charge. Britannica notes that he was summoned to France to discuss a new crusade and the accusations against his order, which already shows how far the struggle had moved from the battlefield to church procedure and royal control. Molay was arrested with the French Templars on October 13, 1307. Under torture, he confessed to some of the charges, then later pulled that confession back when papal delegates reopened the inquiry. The order was officially suppressed in 1312, and in March 1314, a commission of cardinals sentenced Molay and other senior Templars to perpetual imprisonment. The turning point came when Molay publicly retracted again. Because he was now treated as a relapsed heretic, Philip IV's officers had him burned in Paris that same afternoon. So the best-known Templar leader did not fall in combat, die on crusade, or die defending a castle. He died through arrest, interrogation, church judgment, and royal punishment.
That is why his death matters so much in medieval history. It shows that a knightly order could be broken not only by enemy armies, but by the combined force of monarchy and legal process. And that makes a sharp contrast with the Hospitallers, whose leadership story in the same broad era ended in a much quieter way. Number 2. Juan Fernández de Heredia. Juan Fernández de Heredia gives almost the opposite ending. The Hospitallers were another major crusading order, first founded in Jerusalem and later centered on Rhodes, and unlike the Templars, they survived the early 14th century. Heredia served as Master of Rhodes from 1377 to 1396, but he is remembered not only as a military leader. He was also a diplomat, a court figure, and a major patron of historical writing. By the end of his life, he was spending more time in Avignon than on campaign, which already shows how wide the role of a Grand Master had become. The key point here is simple but important. Sources describe Heredia dying in old age at the papal court in Avignon in early March 1396, at roughly 90 years old. That is a very different kind of ending from what people expect when they hear the words medieval military order. There was no sudden battlefield collapse, no execution, no heroic last stand at a breached wall. Instead, the head of one of Europe's biggest knightly orders ended his days as an elderly international administrator, far from the first generation of crusading warfare that had created the order in the first place. That tells you something valuable about the Hospitallers themselves. By the late 14th century, they were not just a band of fighting monks. They were a durable institution with diplomacy, property, regional networks, and a leadership class that could move through royal courts and papal circles as naturally as through war. Heredia's death in Avignon is one of the clearest examples of that shift. If Molay's death shows how an order could be crushed from above, Heredia's death shows how another order survived by becoming more adaptable and more organized.
The next case swings back the other way, because the Teutonic Order still produced a leader whose end came in one of the biggest battles of the late Middle Ages. Number 3. Ulrich von Jungingen. Ulrich von Jungingen, the Grand Master of the Teutonic Order, died in exactly the setting people usually imagine when they think about armored religious warriors. The Teutonic Order had started in the crusader world, but by the late Middle Ages, it had become a major power in Eastern Europe, ruling from Prussia and fighting long campaigns around the Baltic. Britannica describes the order as a major force in Eastern Europe, and that matters because by Ulrich's time, the Grand Master was not just a commander of knights. He was effectively the head of a military state. In 1409, Ulrich declared war on Poland and Lithuania. The following year, the conflict reached its turning point at the Battle of Grunwald on July 15, 1410. Britannica states that the battle ended the Order's expansion along the southeastern Baltic coast, and that the Teutonic Knights lost their Grand Master along with much of their first rank of warrior nobles. That Grand Master was Ulrich von Jungingen. So unlike Jacques de Molay, whose end came in custody, Ulrich died in open war, in a major defeat, at the moment the Order's military image was taking its hardest blow. What makes his death especially important is not just the fact that he was killed. Medieval leaders died in battle all the time. The real point is that his death came in a battle that changed the whole direction of the Order. After Grunwald, the Teutonic Order still existed, but its image of unstoppable expansion was broken, and its long decline became much harder to hide. In other words, Ulrich's death was not an isolated battlefield loss.
It became part of the breaking point in the Order's high phase. That is why he stands out so strongly among knightly Order leaders. He died doing the most traditional thing a Grand Master could do, but the effect of that death was much bigger than one day of fighting. And if Grunwald shows a major Order badly wounded, but still alive, the Sword Brothers show what happened when a master's death came with almost immediate institutional ruin.
Number 4. Volkwin. Volkwin, also written as Volkwin, was the Grand Master of the Order of the Brothers of the Sword, a crusading order founded in Livonia in 1202. Britannica says the order was created as a permanent military body to protect church conquests and force the conversion of local pagan tribes, and it followed rules modeled on the Templars. In other words, this was a classic early 13th century frontier order, built for aggressive expansion in the Baltic world. His death came in September 1236 at the Battle of Saulay. The detail that makes this story so striking is the situation the order was in when the disaster happened. Britannica says the Sword Brothers were returning through Semigalia after a raid into Lithuanian Samagitia, burdened with booty, when a combined force of Semigalians and Samogitians hit them hard. Volkwin was killed in the fighting, and the defeat effectively destroyed the Order's military strength. 1 year later, the survivors had to be reorganized under the Teutonic Order. That gives Volkwin one of the clearest cause and effect deaths on this whole list. Some leaders died, and their orders kept going with limited damage. Some died, and their orders changed slowly over decades. Volkwin died, and his order, as an independent force, was basically finished. There was no long recovery, no quiet succession, and no chance to reshape the story afterward. The defeat at Saulay cut straight through the Order's military credibility and its future.
It is also a reminder that frontier warfare in the medieval world could turn fast. An order that had looked dominant a few years earlier could be wrecked on the way home from one campaign. So when people talk about medieval knightly orders as permanent armored machines, Volkwin's death is a good reality check. These were powerful organizations, but they were still vulnerable to overreach, bad timing, local resistance,
and one catastrophic battle. From the Baltic frontier, the story now moves to Iberia, where the great Spanish orders give a much wider range of endings, starting with a master of Santiago, who seems to have died not in battle at all, but while traveling in old age. Number 5. Pelayo Pérez Correa. Pelayo Pérez Correa is one of the most famous masters of the Order of Santiago, and his death is a great example of why the record can be more interesting than the legend. The Order of Santiago was founded in Spain around 1160 to fight in frontier war and protect pilgrims on the road to Santiago de Compostela. Pelayo became one of its major leaders in the 13th century, and later research on his final years shows that the order expanded heavily during his long rule. At first glance, he looks like exactly the kind of man people expect to die in a campaign. The documents point somewhere else. The Real Academia de la Historia identifies him as dying at Montalban in January 1275, and a detailed study of his death argues that a financial record from September of that same year refers to money spent on the death of Master Pelayo there. The same study places his last journey after a trip connected to the papal court, while another article says he died while passing through Montalban on the return journey, already very old. So the strongest reading is that Pelayo Pérez Correa did not die in battle. He died on the road during travel after decades of command.
That matters because Pelayo later became wrapped in heroic memory, and men like him are often remembered only through conquest stories and martial legends. But the paperwork gives a more human ending. After a lifetime of campaigning, administration, negotiation, land management, and travel between courts and commanderies, the Master of Santiago seems to have reached the end not on a field of victory, but in transit. That is very medieval in its own way. Leaders of military orders were not only fighters, they were also diplomats, landlords, judges, and constant travelers. Pelayo's death captures that wider reality. He had lived the hard public life of a frontier order for years, and in the end, the burden of movement and age seems to have mattered more than one final battle. The next case, from Calatrava, pulls the story back to the battlefield, but in a more realistic way than people usually picture, because its master was not cut down in a single dramatic instant. He was wounded first, and then died after the fighting. Number 6. Ruy Pérez Ponce de León. Ruy Pérez Ponce de León, master of the Order of Calatrava, gives a death that feels very typical of the Iberian military orders. Calatrava was one of the major Spanish military and religious orders, founded in the 12th century to defend frontier territory and take part in the long wars of medieval Iberia. Ruy was named master in 1284, which put him at the head of an order whose whole identity was tied to armed service. His end came in 1295 after the Battle of Isnallos. The sources agree on the basic pattern, even if later retellings differ on small details. Ruy led Castilian and Calatrava forces in a failed action near Granada, was badly wounded in the fighting, and died a few days later. A related battle account notes that after the defeat at Isnallos, he succumbed to his wounds soon afterward. So this was not a courtroom death like Molé's, not an elderly death in residence like Heredia's, and not an instant institutional collapse like Volkwin's. It was the kind of death that frontier commanders probably feared most, because it was so ordinary. A battle goes wrong, the line breaks, the leader survives the field, and then the wounds finish the job. That kind of ending tells you a lot about Calatrava. The order's masters were exposed. They were not distant administrators sending others forward while they stayed safe behind walls. When major campaigns happened, they were there, and that meant the political head of the order could be lost through the same chaos
that killed ordinary fighting men. It also shows how thin the line could be between survival and disaster in medieval warfare. A master could build status for years and lose everything in one failed expedition. Rui's death is not the most famous on this list, but it may be one of the most representative. It looks exactly like what a hard frontier military order was built to risk. And that makes a good bridge to the Order of Alcantara, where another master would charge into frontier war and end up dead on the field in a campaign that even contemporaries saw as reckless. Number 7. Martín Yáñez de la Barbuda. Martín Yáñez de la Barbuda, master of the Order of Alcantara, died in 1394 in one of the clearest examples of a knightly order leader pushing too far. The Order of Alcantara was another major Spanish military and religious order founded to defend the frontier in medieval Iberia. By Martín's time, its masters were not only military figures, but also major regional power holders. That is part of what makes his final campaign so revealing. The sources say Martín invaded Granada in 1394 and that the consequences were disastrous. A study on the period says plainly that the results were tragic and that the master died on the battlefield.
Another source on the Granada War also notes that Martín Yáñez de la Barbuda invaded in April 1394 and was killed in the fighting. The campaign appears to have gone ahead without proper royal backing, which made the defeat even more serious because it risked dragging a wider frontier system into crisis. What stands out here is how personal the disaster feels. This was not the death of an old man finishing paperwork. This was the death of a master who acted like a war captain and paid the full price for it. In that sense, Martín's end fits the stereotype of the aggressive medieval order leader, but the context makes it more interesting. The failure did not look glorious. It looked rash, destabilizing, and costly. That is an important difference, because real medieval warfare was full of badly timed raids, broken truces, poor coordination, and leaders who misread the situation. Martín's death belongs in that more realistic category. It is one of the clearest reminders that the heads of these orders could still behave as half-independent military actors, and that when they got it wrong, they could die before anyone had time to turn the event into a clean, heroic legend. From there, the story shifts to Portugal, where the head of the Order of Avis did something none of these other masters managed. He became a king, and his death looked nothing like a battlefield fall. Number 8. John of Avis. John of Avis, better known as John I of Portugal, shows how different the later history of a military order could become. Britannica says he was made master of the military order of Avis at the age of 6, and later he became king of Portugal and founder of the Avis dynasty. That is already a major shift in what an order leader could represent. In effect, a title from a military order became part of royal power and a ruling house. His death, accordingly, was not the death of a crusading commander in combat. Britannica records that he was born in Lisbon in 1357 and died there on August 14th, 1433, after ruling from 1385 to 1433. So the most famous leader connected to the Order of Avis ended his life in the capital, with the order already tied to kingship and state building, rather than only monastic warfare. That makes John important for this topic, even though his death is less dramatic than Molle's or Ulrich's. He proves that by the late medieval period, the biggest military orders were not all following the same path. Some were still losing masters in frontier campaigns. Some were becoming more court-centered. And in Portugal, one of them had helped create a ruling house. John's end, therefore, feels calm on the surface, but historically it matters a lot.
The Master of Avis did not die as a fallen knight. He died as a monarch whose order name had become the name of a dynasty. Once that happens, you are already looking at a different stage of medieval power. And that leads naturally to the Order of Christ, because under John's son, Henry, a Portuguese military order stopped looking mainly toward land frontiers and started putting serious resources into the Atlantic. Number 9. Henry the Navigator. Henry the Navigator is not always the first name people think of when they hear medieval knightly orders, but he absolutely belongs here, because he was made Administrator General of the Order of Christ, the Portuguese order that replaced the Templars and later became its master. Britannica says the resources of the order were used to gather skilled geographers and navigators and equip expeditions. That line matters because it shows a major change in what an order leader could actually do with power. Instead of mainly funding cavalry, castles, and land frontier defense, the order helped finance voyages along the Atlantic and African coasts. Henry died on November 13, 1460, at Vila do Infante, near Sagres. So again, this is not a battlefield death and not a judicial death.
It is the death of a prince administrator whose office in a military order had become part of a much wider project of Portuguese expansion. In older crusading logic, that is a huge shift. The institutional descendant of a crusading order was now helping to push ships outward instead of simply holding a fortified frontier line. There is something especially useful about placing Henry next to John of Avis. Together, they show that in Portugal, the story of knightly orders did not end with suppression or decline alone. It also fed directly into monarchy, oceanic exploration, and state-backed expansion. Henry's death feels quiet compared with some of the men on this list, but that quiet ending is exactly the point. By 1460, one of Europe's major order leaders could die not as a field commander or a condemned prisoner, but as the organizer of institutions, money, expertise, and long-range planning. That is about as far as you can get from the old image of a master shouting on horseback at the front. The final example brings the story back to Spain and back to war, because the master of Montesa would still die the old way, on campaign, very late in the medieval period. Number 10. Felipe de Aragon y Navarra. Felipe de Aragon y Navarra, master of the Order of Montesa, closes this list with a death that feels traditionally medieval, even though it came very late. Montesa was the Aragonese military order founded in 1317 after the fall of the Templars, and Britannica places it among the later Iberian orders created after the temple was dissolved. Felipe became the 10th master of Montesa in 1484, after holding high church office, which already tells you how closely late medieval noble, clerical, and military careers could overlap. The key fact is straightforward. Real Academia de la Historia identifies him as dying at Baza on July 10, 1488, and academic work on his career says he found death in the Granada War. Another study of Montesa's frontier missions places him at the head of the order during the 1488 expedition, and notes that he died in that campaign. So, unlike John of Avis or Henry, Felipe did not end as a ruler in a capital or as an administrator near Sagres. He died in active war. What makes him such a strong final case is the timing. By 1488, this was already a late example of the old frontier style of knightly order leadership. Felipe had come from high church office, yet he still died on campaign. Montesa itself had been created out of the wreck left by the Templars, but one of its later masters still met the kind of death people most associate with medieval orders. That is what makes Felipe de Aragon y Navarra stand out. In his case, late medieval change and old military tradition
sat side by side in the same man, and the older tradition was still strong enough to kill him in war.